Hi biology, this is Miss Peterson, and today we're going to talk about are you what you eat and what are the biological molecules that we find in food. So I've seen you guys walk in my classroom with some pretty great treats. So that might include Monster Energy drink, maybe a Frappuccino, never a steak, but you never know, and often an apple. But I have to say that none of you actually look like apples to me, even though I know you eat them. And so what does it mean exactly to say you are what you eat? So today we're going to be talking about the molecules that cells are made of and the molecules that are found in food. And so our goal today is by the end of this period to be able to analyze a food label to determine the kinds of molecules we find in cells. Hopefully you understand those molecules and also understand a little bit about the structure of those molecules. So the first molecule, well, before we start talking about molecules, let's talk about some facts and some questions that we know. So some facts that we know are that all organisms are made of cells, and those cells are the smallest living structure that we can think of. All of those cells are made of molecules that are put together, and all molecules are made of atoms. And if we think about it, we actually have some rules about atoms that we can add to this. So one thing that we know is that atoms last forever, and we know that atoms have mass. We also know that energy lasts forever, and that will come into this later. You guys listed some questions yesterday, but most of your questions had to do with the movement of mass and the movement of atoms when somebody gains and loses weight. And in order to think about that and talk about that, we have to think about what kinds of molecules those cells are made of. So that's what we're going to be thinking about today. In order to answer that question, we're going to look at some food labels. So I have some structured food labels that we're going to start with, and all those food labels contain 100 grams as a serving size. And that will help us actually do math a little bit easier. So that means that every gram of mass that we have makes up 1% of the material of the food that we're going to be considering. So as we look at these labels, we will have a little easier time with the math portion of it. So the first one that we're going to talk about, or the first molecule we're going to talk about, is carbohydrates. And chances are most of you have heard about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are made up of the molecule fiber, the molecule starch, and then also the molecules simple sugar. There are other carbohydrates, but when we're thinking about food, these are the three main things we think of. So if I look at this food label, I see carbohydrates right there, and I see fiber listed, I see sugar listed, and then what's ever left over is usually a starch. If I look at this simple sugar right here, I will see a carbon-carbon ring with some oxygen and hydrogen hanging off of it. This is a simple 6-carbon sugar that we call glucose. And if I look really, really closely at this starch, what I'll see is that it contains these simple sugars that are in a ring that are all bonded together in a long string. And these starches usually aren't just a long string. They might branch off going this way, and they might branch off going this way. And so starches are actually made of simple sugars that are bonded together. Fibers are also made of simple sugars bonded together, but their bonds are different, and so fiber is not digestible at all. So our first molecule is carbohydrates, and the unit that makes up carbohydrates are simple sugars, or monosaccharides. The second molecule that we're going to talk about are fats, and I love fats. We also call them lipids. They're a little bit different in terms of their structure from other biological molecules. Instead of being long chains, fats contain one glycerol molecule, like this one right here, and hanging off of that glycerol molecule are these 3 fatty acid legs. Now, some lipids have 2 fatty acid legs, some might have only 1 fatty acid leg, but the kind that we're talking about today are ones that have 3 fatty acid legs hanging off of them. Now, fats are usually broken down on a label, so here's the total fat, into saturated fat and trans fats, but you may have heard of other types of fats like monounsaturated and polyunsaturated and fats like that. These make up things like olive oil or butter or cream, all of those delicious, delicious things. So again, our second molecule is a fat, and it's made up of 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Our final molecule that we're going to be talking about are proteins. And if I say protein, you're probably going to think of muscle, or you might think of that juicy hamburger I just showed you. And all of that is true. But in reality, the purpose that most cells have is to make protein so it can function. So all cells contain proteins. Proteins are very similar to carbohydrates in that they contain these chains of molecules that are bonded together in a long line like this. And each of those smaller molecules that are bonded together are called amino acids. Amino acids are a little bit like an alphabet. There are 20 different amino acids, and each of these amino acids have slightly different properties. So if I string them in a long line, they will have different properties based on the kinds of amino acids that are present. They then fold up into structures that have specific functions within a cell, and we'll talking about that more later. If I look at this label right here, I see proteins listed right here. Proteins are usually not subdivided into other kinds of proteins, but you may have heard the term essential amino acids, like on cereals, and that has to do with the kinds of amino acids that are available to make new proteins inside of your cells. So again, proteins are made up of amino acids that are linked together. So let's think about it. We have 3 different kinds of organic molecules in cells. We've talked about what organic means. We have carbohydrates. They're made up of sugars linked together to make a starch, or possibly just a single sugar is considered a carbohydrate. We have lipids that contain a glycerol and 3 fatty acids hanging off that glycerol like little legs. And then we have proteins that are made up of amino acids that are linked together. If we look closely, we can determine some atoms that are found in these 3 different biological molecules. So the first atom that we might notice right off is carbon. They all contain carbon, and that makes sense because all molecules that are considered organic contain carbon. These also contain oxygen. So if I look closely, I see oxygen here, I see oxygen here, I see oxygen here. They also all contain hydrogen, those little white dots like there and there and there. Proteins contain an additional atom that's very important, and that's nitrogen. So nitrogen is required in order to make amino acids. So let's think about minerals. If you look at your food label, you'll also see minerals that are listed. You might see iron, you might see calcium, you might see sodium, you might see nitrogen or phosphorus, and those are what we call minerals. So this is potassium, here's calcium. These are really, really important for cellular function, but they don't add any mass, and they definitely don't add any energy to the cell. So if we look here, we see that cholesterol and sodium here, vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, vitamin A, and vitamin C add way, way, way less than 1 gram to the mass of the cell. So when we're thinking about mass, we only think about the large biological molecules, and we don't include the mass that is made up of vitamins and minerals. They're really important, like I said, but they don't actually make up the mass of a cell. So the other thing that's inside cells is water. And so if I look at the food label, it will tell me the biomass that is in the cells of the thing that was living that you are eating. And that biomass includes fat, it includes carbohydrates, and it includes protein. So biomass includes all the organic matter. And whatever is left over is what is going to be water. So I can actually calculate that. So I can look at this food label and I can calculate how much water is in 100 grams of carrots. So let's take a close look at that. I can look at the organic material in carrots. I might see by looking at this label that there's 1 gram of protein. I might see that there's 10 grams of carbohydrates, and I would see that there's 0 grams of fat. The inorganic materials, like the minerals and the cholesterol that are here, make up less than 1 gram. So if I add up all the biomass together, I have 1 gram plus 10 gram plus 0 gram equals 11 grams. Now remember, the carrots weighed or had a mass of 100 grams to start off with. So if I take that 100 grams of carrots and I subtract the 11 grams of biomass, whatever is left over is going to be water. And after I do math, I find out that those carrots are about 89 grams or 89% water. So plant roots, like carrots, often are anywhere upwards of 85 to 90% water. So that's true of carrots. Let's think about muscle cell, like beef. So if I look closely, I will see that there are 21 grams of fat. I see that there's 0 grams of carbohydrate right here. I see that there's 18 grams of protein. And if I add those all together, notice that the cholesterol and vitamins are less than 1% and the minerals are less than 1%. That equals about 39%. That means that the remaining 60% or 61% is all water. So that's right, we are all just large bags of seawater transporting ourselves around the earth, just like that beach. So we can talk about atoms, but we can also talk about the energy in cells, because remember, food doesn't just supply atoms, it also supplies energy. The unit of energy that we talk about for food is called a calorie, and a calorie is a measure of chemical energy that's available in those cells when we eat it. So something might have more chemical energy and therefore more calories, or it might have less chemical energy and fewer calories. And remember that those chemical energy is stored in the carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds of those molecules. Okay, well, if that's true, let's think about which molecules would have chemical energy. So if I look closely at the fats have lots and lots of chemical energy. In fact, they have 9 grams of chemical energy stored in those carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds. If I look closely at the carbohydrates, they also, and that glucose right over there, they also contain carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, and so therefore they have about 4 calories per gram of energy in carbohydrates. Proteins are really similar. So if I look closely at that protein, it also has lots of carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, and there are about 4 calories per gram of protein available for energy if I need it. Let's look at the water. Does the water have any carbon-carbon or carbon-hydrogen bonds? Well, water doesn't even contain carbon, so it does not contain energy. How about those minerals like nitrates, potassium, calcium? Well, none of them contain carbon either, so they do not have any chemical energy. So the molecules that supply chemical energy include carbohydrates, they include fats, and they include proteins. So now it's time to try it yourself. When you are done with this PowerPoint, you're going to use the food label cards to fill in the table showing the materials in different kinds of cells on your food labels worksheet. I'm giving you 6 food labels. You are going to have to go out and find the rest of the food labels from people in your class or from Ms. Peterson in order to fill out the rest of your table. And then what I'd like you to do is identify patterns you notice when you compare animal cells to different parts of plant cells to decomposer cells. So remember that plant cells might be different depending if they're a leaf or a stem or a seed. Try and see if you can find patterns about what kinds of molecules are in food depending on what that organism does. Remember that cells are really complicated. We only showed you little tiny molecules. Most molecules have hundreds or even thousands of carbon atoms in them. There are also other large organic molecules like DNA. Those molecules don't necessarily supply mass, but they're really important. So we're going to spend all of second semester talking about DNA. Are you what you eat? Well, let's think about it. The average human is 60% water, 1% carbohydrate, 15% 15% protein, and 23% fat. In fact, we contain all the biological molecules that are in our food. We just contain them in different amounts. So even though you might live on carbohydrates because you're a teenager, you're made up mostly of water and of fat and of protein and very few carbohydrates. So I would say that we are what we eat, but something has changed about the matter after we eat it. All right, biology, stay curious, and I'll talk to you guys soon.